Zoom. Willkommen zurück zur Ringvorlesung zur Klimakrise. Vorneweg wie immer noch ein paar Ankündigungen. Am 7.12. findet der Nachhaltigkeitsschnack am Tiny House statt. Okay. Da gibt es gratis Glühwein und Punsch bei einem lockeren Austausch zum Thema Nachhaltigkeit und bringt also eure FreundInnen und Ideen mit, zieht euch warm an und dann könnt ihr euch ganz kreativ werden bei dem Thema, wie man die Uni nachhaltiger gestalten kann. Dann auch noch eine Information zur Ringvorlesung selber. Am 19.12. findet die nämlich nicht mal als Vorlesung, sondern mal als Podiumsdiskussion statt, anlässlich der COP28. Dafür haben wir 4 Gäste eingeladen, die teilweise sogar in Dubai vor Ort sind. Ihr kennt zum Beispiel Grace Mbungu von ihrem Vortrag zur Klimagerechtigkeit. Ein bekanntes Gesicht ist auch Franziska Müller, Professorin an der Universität Hamburg. Und außerdem werden uns Adenike Oladosu von FFF Nigeria und Vertreterinnen der Taiwan Youth Climate Coalition zu Gast sein. Ihr habt nun die Möglichkeit, die Podiumsdiskussion mitzugestalten und eure Fragen an die TeilnehmerInnen und auch generell zur COP28 zu stellen über eine Umfrage. Den Link dazu erhaltet ihr in den nächsten Tagen per Mail, aber ihr könnt den auch auf Instagram oder auf eurer Lehrplattform finden. Außerdem bleibt mir noch, euch viel Erfolg beim 2. Online-Test zu wünschen, denn dieser startet heute Abend. Und wie immer gilt, diese Vorlesung wird aufgezeichnet. Das heißt, falls ihr euch hier im Raum meldet und eine Frage stellen möchtet, aber nicht möchtet, dass eure Stimme mit aufgezeichnet wird, sagt mir das, dann kann ich eure Frage für euch stellen. Die Teilnehmenden über Zoom können die F&A-Funktion für ihre Fragen benutzen. Genau, nun zu unserem heutigen Gast. Heute ist Hamza Hamouchene bei uns zu Gast und er ist algerischer Forscher und Aktivist und er lebt und arbeitet in London. Von dort joint er uns heute auch über Zoom. Und er ist Koordinator des Nordafrika Programms des Transnational Institutes in London. Und der Fokus seiner Arbeit liegt auf Klimagerechtigkeit und demokratischen Energien. Dazu hat er auch bereits sein zweites Buch verfasst. Das ist im Oktober diesen Jahres erschienen. Und es heißt Dismantling Green Colonialism. Der geographische Schwerpunkt seiner Forschung ist die arabische Region. Diese ist für zukünftige grüne Energien total attraktiv, aber bereits jetzt gibt es dort einige Herausforderungen. Zum Beispiel ist die Region durch den Klimawandel stark beeinträchtigt und auch die kolonialistische Strukturen kommen in dem Bezug von grünen Energien zutage. Genau, dazu wird uns Hamza heute mehr erzählen. So, thank you for joining us, Hamza. We're looking forward to learning more about dismantling green colonialism and energy justice. The screen is yours.
Thanks a lot, Freddie, for this introduction. First of all, do you hear me well? And do you see my screen well? Just to be sure.
Yes, we do.
Perfect. All right. So thanks. Obviously, I'm not going to speak in German. I'm going to speak in English. Thanks, Freddie, for the kind introduction. And thanks for Thea for inviting me and organizing and communicating with me all these last few days. As you explained, I'm going to present today the main arguments and ideas that we put in the book, Dismantling Green Colonialism, Energy and Climate Justice in the Arab Region. The book has been published by Pluto Press in the UK in October. It's available for sales and to purchase, and it's also open access. And I'm going to give you the details at the end. But before I'll tell you more about the objectives of the book and why did we publish this book and why now, I'd like to give you a general context about the situation in the region. Usually I start these lectures by saying, why do we talk about the energy transition? Why do we talk about the green transition or the transition towards renewable energy? There is a lot of talk all over the world, in the mainstream media, by politicians, by various stakeholders of the transition. But why do we talk about it? It is clear. We talk about it because there is an escalating ecological crisis, and we have also a worsening climate breakdown, and we are seeing the impacts all over the world, worldwide. And those manifestations of the ecological and climate crisis are clear in the Arab region. So we have pollution, environmental degradation, the loss of soil fertility, the exhaustion of natural resources, water poverty, as well as the intensifying impacts of the climate crisis, from desertification, prolonged droughts, recurrent heat waves, floodings, like the floodings we've seen in Libya a few months ago that led to more than 10,000 fatalities, wildfires like in Algeria, hundreds of deaths, and so forth. And this ecological and climate crisis does not happen in a vacuum. It intersects with other forms of crisis. So we have the food crisis, we have the energy crisis, we have the socio-economic crisis, as well as a political crisis in certain countries in the Arab region. So for me, in order to apprehend or to understand the ecological crisis appropriately, we need to grapple with the capitalist extractivist model of development that has been imposed on the region since colonial times. So what do I mean by extractivism? Just briefly, extractivism is a mode of appropriation and accumulation that has been unleashed all over the planet since the 15th century with the European conquests of the Americas. And as you can imagine, this process has been shaped by blood, by violence, by exploitation, by theft and plunder. And a similar process has taken place in the Arab region through in the colonial period, through starting from the 19th century. But strictly speaking, extractivism refers to those activities which remove large quantities of natural resources that are not processed or processed to a limited degree, especially for exports to the international market. And in that respect, extractivism is not limited to fossil fuels or to minerals. It can also be present in industrial farming, agrobusiness, forestry, fishing, and even tourism with its intense water use. Throughout my field visits to sites of extractivism, either fossil fuels or mining or agrobusiness in the North African region, specifically Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, I've seen what the dependency school describe as the development of underdevelopment, or the development of maldevelopment, or what the British Marxist David Harvey calls the accumulation by dispossession. We can see two sides of that story. The wealth or the riches in natural resources underneath those communities, and at the same time, environmental destruction, unemployment, underdevelopment, diseases, and so forth. And this is the paradox of extractivism, as it creates sacrifice zones where the bodies and the health and the water and the air and the environment of local people are being sacrificed in order to maintain the accumulation of capital. And when I say sacrifice zone, I really mean it. Like in my home country, Algeria, Ain Saleh is one of the richest gas towns in the African continent. But you look at its infrastructure, it's very poor. The only hospital that they have, they call the hospital of death. And the examples are so many in the region, and reproduce or tell the same story of destruction and dispossession. And this is not just in the Arab region, but in many parts of the world, especially in the global south. And when we talk about extractivism, we cannot disentangle it from the global war machinations and the militarist governance of the world. So, and in this respect, Iraq and Libya warrant more attention as they are the victims of the violence caused by these fossil fuels and the Western fighter jets and bombs that go searching for their abundance. And when we talk about extractivism, I feel for you as students and as scholars and people looking into these questions, I feel this analytical framework, or let's say extractivism, needs to be put into a broader analytical frameworks. And personally, I use ecological and equal exchange and ecological imperialism because I find them very useful. And there is a lot of literature around them, so I really encourage you to explore and investigate. But basically, what these ideas and framings tell us is that the environment, we see environmental disparities, basically benefits from the exploitation of the environment, and the burdens from the environmental degradation are distributed with marked inequality across different social groups, from urban to rural areas, as well as between nations, what we call between North and South, or the centers, cores of the global capitalist economy and its peripheries. So basically, an equal ecological exchange is the asymmetrical transfer of the ecosystem goods and services from one region of the world, the peripheries generally, of the world, to another one, the cores. And ecological imperialism can be defined as the subjugation of the economic, political, and social institutions of a generally peripheral country for the biophysical, metabolic needs of a generally core country. And this is inextricable from the purpose of making such resources accessible and amenable to the needs of capital accumulation. So now let's move to the second part of my presentation, where I would focus on the questions of renewable energies and the transition or the energy transition in the Arab region. So in the midst of all what I described, ecological and climate crisis, the destruction and the dispossession, we know that a transition to a more sustainable system has become inevitable. But justice is not guaranteed in that process. And that's what interests me a lot, the question of justice, of making this process just and equitable for all the people involved. Let's start with who tackles, who put forward some solutions to the climate crisis. So the global elites every year, with their advisors, with the media representatives, with the lobbyists, corporate lobbyists, including from the fossil fuel industry, meet in the climate talks, what is called the Conference of Parties. The Arab region has hosted 5 conferences, 5 COPs, since their inceptions in 1995. The most recent one are the one in Marrakesh in 2016, COP22. Last year, COP27 and the military dictatorship of Egypt. And this year, actually, COP is ongoing. It started last Thursday, the 30th of November, and it will end this Tuesday, 12th of December, and it is being held in Dubai in the Arab Emirates. And I just wanted to put like this fact there for you. The current COP28 president is the head of the Abu Dhabi Petroleum Company. So the industry, the fossil fuel industry, that is most responsible in causing the climate crisis, they have one of their representatives as the person leading the climate talks to resolve that crisis. It's like, I always use the analogy, is like putting the arsonist in charge of putting out the fire they caused. So this is the contradiction, and signals a really, how can I say, a pattern that we've seen in the last few decades, because this process has been ongoing for 30 years. And as Greta Thunberg described the process as blah, 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 and I completely agree with her. The process has failed and is bankrupt, and it's given space to fossil fuel lobbyists. I just read an article today that the number of fossil fuel lobbyists attending COP28 is around 4 times the one that attended in the COP27 last year. Like, this is a record, like, by far. But the story does not end there, because those COPs, those climate talks, have been hijacked by corporate interests and the private sector that are pushing for profit-making false solution, like carbon trading or what we call net zero. So all the companies now, from Shell to BP to Siemens, all of them have a decarbonization strategy or net zero targets. But and then we have nature-based solutions. But in reality, these are just, polluting permits, maintaining the status quo while just greening the economy. And I think we need them to be really wary of those market mechanisms that are really false solutions, or not solutions at all. Let's come to specifically to the region. So there is this Orientalist colonial environmental narrative that has been developed since colonial times, specifically actually in my home country, Algeria, under French colonialism, that depicts the deserts or the Saharas in the Arab region as vast, empty and sparsely populated, representing now a kind of an El Dorado of cheap green energy that would provide Europe with its energy needs while maintaining its energy-intensive production and consumption patterns. But that narrative is deceptive because it ignores questions of sovereignty, questions of property, and masks the ongoing relations or neo-colonial relations or the global hierarchies of power, facilitating land grabs, the dispossession of people, the confiscation of land, and their exclusion from any say around the just transition. And there are many examples in the region that show how extractivist or green extractivist practices or exploitation or neo-colonial dynamics are being perpetuated even in projects of renewable energies. And now I'm going to go specifically into these examples and tell you a kind of a story that you'll see what is happening in the region and that we need to investigate more and even challenge such neo-colonial projects. But first of all, as always, I'd like to put a definition to the concept that I use, even a brief definition that you can explore later. So what is green colonialism, or what do we mean by green colonialism in the book? Green colonialism is the extension of the colonial relations of domination, of plunder, of dispossession, as well as the dehumanization of the other to what we call the green era, or the period of renewable energy, while externalizing the socio-environmental costs from the core regions or the richest regions to the periphery, poorest regions. Basically, we have a kind of prioritizing of the environmental and energy needs of one area of the world or some countries in the world over other countries. And in a way, we have the same system remaining, but with a different source of energy. So we're moving from fossil fuels, from coal, gas, and oil to renewable energy, but the same capitalist imperialist system remain intact. But something that needs to be said when we talk about a global energy transition, if there is such a thing, is that at least most of it is happening in the richest countries in the global north, with some pockets in the global south. But that transition is predicated on the continuation of the extraction of base metals and rare earth minerals like copper, cobalt, nickel, lithium, graphites, and others. The question that we need to ask, where would these resources come from? That's always we need to ask, where would these resources, if we're going to continue the same patterns of production and consumption here in the global north, in the west, and in some rich pockets in the global south, where would the resources come from? Actually, right now, there is not enough to continue the same patterns and to do all the needs of the world with the same rates as we have now. But most of these resources are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They have a lot of cobalts. Indonesia, they have a lot of nickel. There are some Latin American countries like Chile, Bolivia, Argentina. They have a lot of lithium, and other countries as well, Australia and China, where environmental destruction would intensify and workers' exploitation would continue. So this is basically what we mean by green colonialism. Green grabbing. Green grabbing is another interesting concept, and it refers to those dynamics of land grabbing or land grabs for a supposedly green agenda. So we have like projects that dispossess indigenous communities, conservation projects or reforestation projects that dispossess indigenous communities from their land, to the confiscation of communal land to do agrofuels instead of producing food, to big mega solar and wind farms built on agro-pastoralist land without their proper approval and consent. Let me give you a few examples. Either green grabbing, or we can call it green colonialism as well. This Emirati company, Blue Carbon, which is close to the royal family in Emirates, has been recently, just in the last year or so, acquiring huge swaths of land, hundreds of thousands or millions of hectares in Tanzania, Liberia, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Kenya. And you look at the surfaces that they have been leasing, you'll be shocked. 10% of the area of Liberia, 20% of the area of Zimbabwe. And they're gonna use the same colonial environmental story that those lands are empty, people are not using them, which is not correct. Indigenous communities and local people use those lands, you use those forests. But then these projects are acquired for carbon offsets, or what we call carbon trading, or carbon trading, carbon credits. And basically this is a euphemism for pollution permits. Big companies like Shell or BP or Total Energies would buy those carbon offsets in order to continue their own operations. And many studies have debunked the myth that these offsets work. In the long term, they're not working, because 30 years of climate talks, 30 years of pushing for this false solution of carbon trade, and we haven't seen the CO2 emissions going down. The only year that they went down was the year of the pandemic. And above all, these projects that I'm mentioning here are taking place in the African continent, and the African continent is only responsible for 4% of the CO2 emission. So the responsibility is very minimal. So in a way, we are shifting the burden of tackling the climate crisis from the richest and biggest fossil fuel producing countries like the Gulf countries to poorer countries, to African countries. If that's not neocolonialism or colonialism, I don't know what it is. Morocco. In 2016, at the time of the climate talks, the COP22 that were held in Marrakesh that year, the Moroccan monarchy launched this big solar project called Ouarzazate. I don't know if some of you heard of it, but at the time it was hailed as the biggest solar plant in the world. And I think it remains one of the biggest solar plants in the world. But beneath the surface or talk of sustainability, when we scratch a little bit, a bleak picture is revealed. First of all, the project is built on 3,000 hectares of collective lands without the proper approval and consent of local agro-pastoralist communities. So this is a land grab or a green grab, one. Second, the project is what they call a public-private partnership, which is a euphemism for the privatization of profit and the socialization of losses. The contract is in private hands, and Aqua Power is a Saudi company from Saudi Arabia with another Spanish consortium. Basically, they are earning the profits while the project is actually losing money. Since 2016, the project has been losing 80 million euros a year. And who pays for this? Are the Moroccan citizens in a country that is deeply indebted. Such a choice doesn't make sense, especially that a project contracted a huge amount of debt, $9 billion of debt from the World Bank, from the African Development Bank, and from other banks in Europe. And these come with Moroccan guarantees, what some people call de-risking strategies. Basically, if the project fails or the project does not make money, Morocco state guarantees the profits of those private companies. That doesn't make sense. And then even looking at the environmental credentials of such a project, we reveal it's using a technology called CSP, concentrated solar power. That technology necessitates usage of a huge amounts of water in order to cool down the system and clean the panels. So in a semi-arid region like Ouarzazate, that doesn't make sense. And I visited the dam where the money was being diverted from drinking water and agriculture to the plant. Is this really green? That's the question that we need to ask. And by the way, populations are still complaining about the project. They are saying we're not benefiting from it. And it's the same story with another project that actually is the manifestation of what I call decarbonization by dispossession, in reference to the concept of coined by David Harvey, the accumulation by dispossession. So we are seeing patterns of decarbonization moving toward renewable energy while dispossessing people. Midelt, 450 kilometers to the northeast of Ouarzazate, is the same story. The pastoralists there have been protesting against one of the biggest hybrid solar plants in the world. They describe it as an occupied land. They say we're not benefiting from this. Our people do not have schools. We don't have the proper infrastructure. And this is the things that we need to be really careful to not reproduce. Yes, we need to move towards renewable energies, but not in this way, not at the expense of local populations, not by dispossessing them. The book has, I'm moving now to another story. I'm going to tell you now another story that the book focuses on. One whole section in the book, I think is around 6 or 7 articles, focuses on another form of accumulation by dispossession in the renewable energy sector. And this is the liberalization, the privatization of renewable energy, and the export orientation. So there are many articles and chapters on Egypt, on Jordan, on Morocco, on Sudan, on Tunisia, talking about how energy is being privatized and how the local market is being opened up to foreign capital, to corporations, to take advantage of it, to make more profits, and then to export. Let me zoom a little bit on Tunisia, because it is a really interesting case. Why I say this? Tunisia's responsibility in the CO2 emission, and listen to this, is 0.07%. So almost nothing. Like the Tunisian country does not, almost nothing compared with Germany or compared with the UK or Saudi Arabia, has no responsibility. But at the same time, it's suffering from an acute climate crisis. The last 4 years, the country has seen a huge drought. So the country suffers from an absolute water poverty. People do not find water to drink. The agriculture is suffering. Small-scale farmers are losing their crops. So it is a real problem. So for Tunisia, the priority shouldn't be climate mitigation, reducing its CO2 emissions, because it does not emit much, or move towards renewable energy as fast as Germany, for example. Its priority is to adapt to climate change, to tackle the impacts of climate crisis, to find new sources of water through desalination, through changing its own destructive and water-intensive agricultural model, because right now it exports a lot of water-intensive agricultural commodities like tomatoes, strawberries, olives, dates, citrus, oranges, and we find them here in our European supermarkets. So maybe these are the priorities of Tunisia. But we see that Tunisia is being pushed by various actors, including the EU, the Dutch, and the Italian that I'm showing here in the picture, to go towards renewable energy, at the same time stem the flows of migration. So basically, we want your resources, including green energy or green electricity, but we don't want people, we want people from Africa. In 2019, in Tunisia, they changed the law to allow for the use of agricultural land for renewable energy projects. Hear this: a country that suffers from an acute food dependency. It imports all what it eats, the staple food, which are the grains, from Ukraine, for example. And we've seen that acute food dependency revealed during the pandemic and during the current war in Ukraine. Since Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2000, was it 21 or 22? I forget about the dates now. So, and the question that we need to ask ourselves right now, transition for whom are we talking about here? Transition towards renewable energy for whom? And then let's go into the export projects that I mentioned earlier. So I documented this Tunur project since 2017. I have been following it and I've written about it. At the time, it was openly saying we're going to build a big solar plant in the south of Tunisia for export, mainly for export to Italy, to the European Union, to the UK. It's a joint venture by Italian, British, and Tunisian, and I think Maltese as well, Maltese investors that want to produce solar energy for export and to feed, they said at the time, I think around 2 million homes in Europe. But the thing that we forget is that Tunisia is not self-sufficient in its energy too. It gets actually a lot of it from its neighboring country, Algeria, gas. It gets it from gas. Most of the electricity Actually, I think the majority of it, like it's in the 90%, comes from gas. That comes from Algeria and some of from its own gas. So isn't the priority for Tunisia to do these renewable projects for its own needs rather than for export? And the same story happens with this X-Links project. I read about it in Bloomberg at the time of the pandemic in 2020, and I didn't believe that this project is gonna happen. I thought it was just a hype. First of all, it needs a lot of money, $22 billion, but then it's just a crazy idea. And I'll try to convey why it is crazy. What they want to do, again, build huge solar plants, not just solar plants, wind farms as well, produce green electricity, and then build undersea cables that needs to be manufactured 3,800 kilometers from southern Morocco to the UK, where I live, like in Devon, the southwest of the UK. 3,800 kilometers. And maybe for you to imagine, so all the coast of Morocco, the Atlantic, and then through Portugal, the Atlantic again, and then Spain, and then France, and then to the UK. Just imagine the crazy thing. What I said, I didn't believe it. I thought it was a hype, but then I saw it at the end of 2021. I saw it in the UK energy security strategy. It was just one line. They said, we're going to consider this project, but that's it. And then this year, the Financial Times reveals, actually this end of September, that the UK is seriously considering this project to bring power from Morocco for its own EU energy security. So we have, you see that what I described earlier, undermining and fossil fuel in terms of extractivism, in terms of predatory practices, in terms of enclosure, land grabbing and dispossession, we are seeing it in here. Just it's green extractivism, green colonialism, or green neocolonialism, call it whatever you want. So it's the same colonial narrative or scheme that we are seeing under our eyes with the unrestricted flow of natural resources, including green electricity from the global south to the global north, while Fortress Europe continue building fences and walls and letting people die in the Mediterranean. And the same story goes, I'm not going to go into the details of the green hydrogen. We've written about it. We published recently, actually, a case study on the impacts, the social and environmental impacts of export-oriented green hydrogen in Morocco. It is on TNI website. I encourage you to read it. I wrote about it as well. And I say it just as a neo-colonial resource grab. The EU, including Germany in this case, want North African countries and other countries in the continent like Namibia, South Africa, Chile, and other, or even the Gulf countries, to produce the green hydrogen that Germany and the EU wants. And we've seen the importance of green hydrogen escalates and become even more important in the time of the war in Ukraine with the plan, the Repower EU, which is the European Commission's plan to end dependence on Russian gas following the invasion of Ukraine. So the target has been quadrupled from 5 million tons to 20 million tons, with 10 millions that needs to be imported primarily from Africa. And the two countries really advanced on that path right now, I think, is Morocco and Egypt. Tunisia is interested. Algeria still depends on fossil fuels. They know that Europe is going to need gas in the near future, so they are betting of it. So again, we are shifting renewable energy from local energy needs to producing green hydrogen for export. But we need to know something about green hydrogen. I don't know if everyone knows. It is a technical matter, but green hydrogen basically is produced from water, from H2O, the molecule of water. When this molecule is, let's say, broken down with green electricity in a process called electrolysis, it releases hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen released is the cleanest form of hydrogen, and that's what they call green hydrogen. Most of the hydrogen produced right now comes from fossil fuels and mainly gas. It's called gray hydrogen and is used in the fertilizer and the fossil fuel industry. But a lot of the protagonists of green hydrogen say it is this miraculous solution. It's gonna resolve all our problems. I don't believe so. I think green electricity is the future. But for me, the focus on this in North African countries, when countries like Morocco, when you look at the renewable energy in the electricity mix, is just 20%. So 80% of the electricity in Morocco is produced from fossil fuels, from coal and gas. So why don't Morocco produce its green electricity or decarbonize its own grid? That's the priority. Or maybe use green hydrogen in its fertilizer industry, not for export, because that comes at an expense. The same thing for Tunisia. People are suffering from droughts and water poverty. So why do we need to build desalination plants to produce that water that needs to electrolyze in order for green hydrogen to be exported? No, we need to make those desalination plants for people to drink water and for the agricultural needs of those countries. And the surfaces are so huge. Like these projects by Total Energies, the French company in southern Morocco, in Guelmim, needs around 180,000 hectares of land. And I had to look at this to know what are we talking about? And it's more than the surface of the London area that I live. And they're gonna use the same colonial orientalist environmental narrative that I told you. It's empty, and we're gonna use it to benefit the local population. And you look at the hydrogen lobbies and and who is behind them, you find all the oil companies in the World Hydrogen Council and Hydrogen Europe, BP, Shell, Aramco, Anglo-American, Total Energies, Equinor, everybody, most of the companies, Eni, the Italian, because they see it as a backdoor to continue their own operations. They know that they're not going to produce green hydrogen in the short term. It's going to be probably gray and blue using an inefficient carbon capture and sequestration technology. So that's why they are pushing. So they can maintain the same infrastructures, the same ports, the same pipelines, and so forth. So Algeria, my home country, so France at the time in 2013 and 2014 banned Total and its French companies from fracking in its own territories in France. But it was given diplomatic support for these companies to go to Algeria and frack. So if that's not, environmental racism and energy colonialism, I don't know what it is. The good thing that people protested against this, but now we don't know, because of the lack of transparency, we don't know if those projects are going ahead or not. Energy transition or energy expansion. I believe what we are seeing right now is an energy expansion, not an energy transition. Yes, there is investment in renewable energy. There is some targets here and there, but in reality, it's happening at the same time of the intensification of exploitation of fossil fuels, more exploring, more drilling. We are seeing more pipelines, project pipelines being proposed, more offshore, more fracking. So, and the numbers back this up. When we look at the levels of subsidies in 2022 to the fossil fuel industry, which is 7 trillion USD. Imagine, and it moved up from 5 trillion in 2020. We understand that we're not seeing the replacement of fossil fuels by renewable energy, at least not yet. And that's what we are seeing in the context of the war in Ukraine and the dash and scramble for gas and varying, resources from various regimes. We've been told that, yeah, we need to move away from the dictator and the bad guy Putin, but we go to, you know, the military dictatorship in Algeria, and the Italians have done that to ask for more gas. We've seen how Sonatrach and Eni signed an additional 9 billion cubic meters to be pumped from this year and the next. And then we've seen Ursula moving and going all around the countries, trying to get more LNG from Egypt, the settler colonial state of Israel, and the authoritarian state of Qatar. Again, we are seeing more gas lock-in, more extractivism, more path dependency, and a potential for substantial stranded assets in those countries themselves. So while all these examples that I described might be called green grabbing, might be called green neocolonialism, or accumulation by dispossession, or decarbonization by dispossession, what is taking place in occupied lands in the Arab region can be described directly as green colonialism. And that's the case of Western Sahara, where many solar plants and wind farms are being built by the Moroccan occupying power in spite of Sahrawis' right for self-determination. The same story happens in occupied Palestine, even in much more brutal and violent way. Israel used the same colonial and orientalist environmental narrative to portray Palestine pre-1948 as an empty, parched desert, which has become a blooming oasis after the establishment of the State of Israel. And in a way, Israel, it's greenwashing its colonialism, covering up its war crimes against the Palestinian people by posing as a green and advanced countries. And Manal Shkair, the Palestinian who wrote the chapter on greenwashing Israeli colonialism and eco-normalization with Arab countries, is a brilliant chapter documenting those dynamics like prosperity projects and those two Israeli companies, ENLT and NewMed Energy, doing in Arab countries. And in here, I think it's important to make a tangent, because we cannot talk about colonialism, green or otherwise, dismantling colonialism or decolonization or climate justice or environmental justice in the Arab region and turn a blind eye to the ongoing genocide, to the ethnic cleansing, to the mass slaughter, to the repression, to the silencing of Palestinians being taken place and perpetrated by an apartheid settler colonial state of Israel, with the active support and abetting of imperialist powers from the US to the EU to the UK to Germany to Italy. We must stand up and rise against and object to the ongoing genocide and call for a permanent ceasefire, and in the long term support the struggle of Palestinians for liberation and the right for self-determination. We cannot just erase Palestinians' livelihoods and bodies. We need to resist the silencing of Palestine activism, including in Germany. It is really hard nowadays to be a Muslim or an Arab or Palestinian in Germany, not fitting for a democracy that preaches human rights and those values around there. Germany cannot weaponize its guilt for the Holocaust by supporting another genocide against the Palestinians. I think what I've seen from the German political media, intellectual and academic establishment is just shocking. We cannot allow this. We need to challenge it, as well as what I've seen from Fridays of the Future Germany. The position is deeply problematic, and I stand with Greta Thunberg to say, when we say no climate justice in occupied land. It's impossible. We cannot ignore what is happening there. If you allow me, I'll finish the context by this slide, where we talk about a transition to where. Three a few articles in the book, especially Adam Haniya and Christian Henderson, talk about the position and the role of the Gulf countries and their configuration in the region and globally. We need to be aware that the Gulf is at the center of contemporary fossil capitalism. The Middle East in general is a key nodal point in the global fossil fuel regime. When we look at the share of global oil production that stood at 35% in 2021 and 36% in 2022, we realize the role the preponderant role of the region in the global fossil fuel regime. And we saw what the Gulf countries are doing. In the summer of 2021, the Saudi energy minister said, we are still going to be the last man standing, and every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. The profits of Aramco, the Saudi company, belittled all the other companies in 2022, 161 billion, exceeding the combined results of Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. Adam Haniya put forward a warning to the global climate justice movement by saying, look, if you are just focusing on Western oil majors and Western oil companies, you are missing the point. You need to look at the Gulf countries. You need to look at the Gulf oil capital, especially with the development of a new East-East hydrocarbon axis in the growing relationships between the Gulf and East Asia, mainly China. And I really, really recommend Adam Haniya's article. So why this book? Why now? Most of the writing on the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, the energy transition is dominated by international neoliberal institutions, from the World Bank to the EU agencies to the German Corporation and GIZ. And these institutions are aligned with the interests of the rich and powerful. Their analysis does not take into account questions of class, of race, of gender, of colonial history and power. The solutions that they put forward, first of all, are coming from experts. Top, bottom, exclude local communities, exclude workers, and really they do not go to the heart or to the root causes of the problem, of the energy crisis, of the climate crisis, of the ecological and food crisis. So the book is an attempt to remedy that in a way. It is a collection of 13 chapters with an introduction from all over the region, from Western Sahara, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Sudan, Palestine, Jordan, and then Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Emirates. And it looks at the questions, it tackles some of the angles of the energy transition and how to make it an equitable and just way. It adopts the framework of the just transition and climate justice, which is not a technical transition, but a systematic one rooted in people-centered renewable energy system, a just transition that entails a radical transformation of our political and economic system, where working people need to be at the heart of such a vision. Just quickly, the main principle of such a program of just transition is different in different places. So what works in Europe may not work in some African countries. What would work in Algeria may not work in South Africa. What would work in rural areas in Morocco might not necessarily work in urban areas there. So we need to be guided by local populations, their imaginations, and the solutions they propose. Just transition is a class issue. Just transition is a gender issue. Just transition is an anti-racist framework. Just transition is not just about the climate and energy. It's about the whole economic system as a whole. It touches on agriculture. It touches on public services, on transport, and how do we produce the stuff that we need in our livelihoods. And just transition is about democratization. either in Europe or in other parts of the world. In other parts of the world, that question is even more acute, because you cannot talk about climate justice under a military dictatorship or under a brutal authoritarian regime or under colonialism, things that we are seeing in the region right now. And just transition is a sovereign project and entails decolonization and anti-imperialism. And that's what the book is focusing about. Before I conclude, just a few ideas that I would like to put there and share with you about some of the alternatives that we are putting forward is we are considering energy as a public good, not as a commodity to be traded and profited from. Access to energy needs to be a human right, and it needs to be controlled by the communities and workers in a democratic way, basically socially controlled, not dominated by markets and the private sector that are only interested in making profits. We need to change the global architecture of finance that subordinates the global South country economies. And we need to put an end to the unequal economic and ecological exchange by the payment of what we call climate debt or climate reparations, not as additional debts or as an additional burden on countries, because that's what climate finance is doing now. They are loans to those countries with interest. No, it needs to be a transfer of wealth and technology. And that's technology transfer is very important in the question of tackling the climate crisis and moving towards renewable energy. For certain countries like Chile or Argentina, or let's say DRC or Indonesia, they have the critical raw materials for the energy transition, and they are putting forward plans for industrialization and moving up the value chain and trying to acquire the technology and end economic dependence. The book basically attempts to advance a deeper analysis of where we are now in terms of the energy transition in the Arab region. It's important to have a better understanding of the current situation, the actors involved, and the potential winners and losers. We need to increase the emphasis on structural critiques in green transition debates. And the book tried to center the voices of activists, scholars, and writers from the Arab region. And it tried also to highlight the urgency of the climate crisis and tried to push back against the entrenchment of extractivism through its green form or energy colonialism, emphasizing the need for holistic analysis and structural changes. And in doing this, it aims to counteract the dominant neoliberal, neocolonial discourse on the green transition that is being promoted and pushed by various international actors in the region. The book uses, as I said, the justice lens and avoids using the security discourse. We tend to avoid demands framed around security, like climate security, food security, or energy security. We want to promote notion of justice, sovereignty, and decoloniality, and support progressive movement forces in the region that are trying to articulate the need for an energy transition, incorporating political, economic, social, class, and environmental analysis, especially that the last COPs, COP27 and COP28, have taken in the region. And I'll finish by this. In any project that you study and analyze, either in Germany or outside, it is really important to use political economy tools at the service of democracy and decolonization, or justice and decolonization. And what I mean by those questions that I find really useful when I do my own research and analysis are: who owns what? Let's look at who are the owners of those initiatives and projects. Is it the local communities, or is it foreign and private capital? Who does what? Who gets what? Who wins and who loses? Who are the winners and losers of such an energy transition, for example? And whose interests are being served? Is it really the interests of the ordinary people? Is it the interest of the worker? Is it the interest of the local community? Is it the interest of the majority? Or is it the interest of the 1% or the minority that try to benefit from the crisis? The point here by asking this question is not just for the sake of curiosity or the sake of publishing a paper or writing a book. The point is to analyze how capitalist and imperialist dynamics work in order to change the world, identify strategic targets and key nodal points for resisting, challenging, and intervening against capital. Third, uncovering the deception of capital trying to reproduce itself under the guise of the green economy. Ultimately, to realize this, and this is a long-term project, it's not going to happen overnight, we need to build the needed and necessary alliances of working people to bring about transformational change. And one day, hopefully, the end of that destructive and exploitative capitalist imperialist system. This is my last slide, I promise. So the book is intended as a tool for activists, not just in the Arab region, but around the world, because it is full of lessons to other contexts in order to avoid the same dispossession practices, the same plunders, the same privatizations, the same, grabbing of resources and land, but also raises important questions in terms of the position of the Middle East, as especially the Gulf countries, as indisputable protagonists in any discussion on climate action, as well as any move away or phase out of fossil fuels. We cannot ignore the Gulf countries. They are powerful, they are rich, and they are developing their own strategies to maintain the status quo. The idea is to continue posing critical questions, to build coalition, alliances, and popular power in support of the solutions for a just transition. The book is 50% right now in Pluto's Liberation Reads, and there is also a link in that page to an open access online, so you can read the book on PDF. Thank you for listening to me. I hope that was useful to you, and I'm happy to listen to your questions.
Thank you so much for these interesting insights into green colonialism and just energy production. There are already some questions here in the question pool, but I wanted to ask if somebody in the room here present has any questions. Okay, so then our first question will be, are there any lands that are available for solar energy production without causing displacement and dispossession?
Do you want me to answer question by question, or you want to pool one or two? I can answer directly. Look, for me, it's not about being opposed to mega solar plants or wind farms, because I feel that we need those mega solar plants and wind farms in some parts of the world, especially that we have a huge climate crisis, an escalating climate crisis, and the window is closing. So we don't have a lot of time to find other solutions. I believe in that kind of centralized project, but the same cooperative model, smaller scale for local communities. But my idea here is the way we do those mega solar or wind farms. For me, I think it's better if you identify a piece of land that you want to do it, is to minimize the impacts on local communities. Nothing is perfect. There has to be a compromise somehow. And we do that in our daily life. States do that all the time. So we need to compromise. But how do we minimize the impacts? Is by actively involving them in shaping those projects, in embracing those projects, in being involved, in benefiting from them. What do they benefit? Do they get real jobs, real trainings in those projects? Are they gonna get cheap green electricity from those projects? Because, if we do those shortcuts like this and end up creating new sacrificing zones and excluding people, first of all, it's immoral. That's one thing. Second thing, it can backfire because people would start protesting. People would start maybe even sabotaging those projects. So in the long term, this is not a solution. What it needs to, that's why I say just transition is about democratization. It's about the working people and local communities at the center. They cannot be left out of it. It needs to be done with them. And this is the challenge, this is the dilemma. And each context is different, either in Germany or the UK or Morocco. But from what we've seen, those projects tend to dispossess people. I told you about the Emirati project Blue Carbon. They are dispossessing indigenous communities. For what? For offsets that do not work. That 70% of those projects, 70% of the profits of the projects go to the private company. So only 30% go to the local countries. So no, and then who controls those projects? For me, it shouldn't be the private sector, because why? The private sector wouldn't care about the environmental safety or the social welfare of local communities. The bottom line for them, the priority is to make profit. And as long as they minimize all investments in those things, they would do it. So these projects need to own socially controlled. For me, I believe in the public sector. They need to be owned by the public. And there are different ownership models. It could be a national company or nationalized, a state company. And at the same time, there are cooperative models where communities have a say in these things. So yeah, it's a bit a convoluted answer to your question, but there are land, but which land and whose land? These are the questions that we need to ask.
Thanks for that explanation. And this also goes into the next question that I wanted to ask you. So you just mentioned that for a just energy transition, there would need to be publicly owned energy production. And if you were to imagine a utopic future of green energies, what would this future look like? What would be other pillars of such a utopia if you were to imagine one?
Great question. And I think that's these are the difficulties for us as scholars and activists, is to imagine that utopia. There is that line that I find very ironic and funny. Somebody once said, I don't remember who, to be honest, said it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Because capitalism has become so overarching and so ingrained and so powerful and infiltrated all our aspects of life that it's really hard to imagine that alternative or that utopia that you are saying. For me, it depends on context. So that's why we cannot have one universal solution for every country or every community. No, it doesn't work like this. I said sometimes, because of the urgency of the climate crisis, we need centralized solutions. And that's why I believe in a public service, public utility, providing energy. And it should be, access to energy should be a human rights, subsidized. People have decent access to cheap and green energy and clean energy. Like we talk differences, like in Europe and even in actually most Arab countries, access to energy is around 99 or 100%. So in Algeria is 99%, in Egypt is 99%. But in other countries, and I don't know if you're aware of this, in the African continent, 70, 80% of the population does not have electricity. Namibia, for example, where that big project of green hydrogen is taking place, 45% of the population does not have access to electricity, like no electricity. Most of the electricity that is present in Namibia comes from South Africa. So the country is not self-sufficient at all. So instead of Namibia investing directly in green electricity, building the solar plants and wind farms for in its own usage. We have all these projects owned by foreign investors, German and British in this case, and pushed by the German government to export, to build all of this to export green hydrogen. It doesn't make sense. No, the priority first, and we need to talk about this, is energy access for Namibian population. For me, this is for Namibian, this is a utopia for Namibians. To have, you know, green electricity, to have those big projects, creating jobs for them, creating local value, not just focusing on companies, you know, siphoning off the value. The other utopias, there are some small utopias at a small scale where people are trying to create cooperatives, building their own small renewable projects. I believe that these are small utopias, but I'm not sure they can be reproduced at scale. It's important to believe in such things, but I don't believe that this is a solution for the climate crisis that we have now, or to satisfy all the needs of the people. In North Africa, another positive thing, especially in Tunisia, there is a working group on energy democracy, trying to create links between local communities where those solar plants are being built and workers in the energy sector, trying to create those links so the interests and people come together in order to build a strong public service in terms of providing energy. This is, for me, if it moves forward, this is a utopia. The utopia for me, at the end of the day, we need to end those relations of dominations and plunder and see, you know, some countries as just how can I say, a dustbin for your waste, or just as a site of creating new sacrifice zones. There will be compromises, there will be difficulties, there will be mistakes, and we need to be imaginative, but it's not up to Hamza to put forward the blueprint for that. It's up to the local communities struggling against those projects. It's up to the trade unionists and workers proposing certain things. So yeah, this is my answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Great points. Thank you for bringing that up. And then there would be a next question that I'd like to ask. Maybe I can group two together this time. We have heard about politics that support colonialist structures, such as double standards with fracking or authoritarian regimes. And you also just mentioned the German government pushing dependency structures. So what would be politics or policies that counter colonial dependencies and counter colonial structures today? And can you maybe give a positive example?
Perfect question. Very good. And I think that goes to the heart of what we are trying to achieve in the book. I'll tell you simply. I give you some examples from, not necessarily from the context in the Arab region, because it's very difficult there right now, but there are some positive experiences. I mentioned the Tunisian Energy Democracy Working Group, and I think and they are trying to expand to other trade unionists to bring that question of energy democracy and energy as a public good, as a public service. And I think this is a good example that we need to support. In terms of the creation of dependencies, I mentioned this, and I'll go to the examples I want to say. So GIZ, the German corporation, do you know that it has an office in the Tunisian Energy Ministry? Imagine that in your energy ministry, you have, let's say, a Chinese corporation trying to influence your policy. What would you call this? You would call this undermining our sovereignty. This is the same thing in Morocco and other countries. The GIZ is a really powerful actor And as I said, is a biased actor, is pushing certain way of doing things through the markets, through the private sector, through opening up, those economies, focusing on export, not raising any questions of the crimes of companies or the historical responsibility in causing the climate crisis that lies in the industrialized West. Nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about climate debts and climate reparations. Nobody talks about technology transfer. So raising awareness and talking about this in a sovereign and just way that focuses on the needs of local communities there and workers there is a first step, I believe. So if we focus on the energy transition, I'll give you an example that I think that gives at least some hope for the future. While it's imperfect, it has its own contradictions that we need to. This is our field of study. We need to grapple with contradictions all the time. Indonesia, as I said, is very rich in nickel reserves. It's, I think, one of the richest countries in nickel reserves. Nickel is a critical raw material, critical for the energy transition. Very critical, especially in manufacturing electrical batteries. So Indonesia said, instead of remaining as a dependent country or just as an exporter of raw minerals, I need to take advantage of that position that I have in the global market right now, because all the world needs to move towards renewables and maybe do electrical cars or electrical batteries and so forth. So what they said we're gonna make a ban on exporting the raw form of the mineral. So we're gonna process it inside Indonesia, create more value inside Indonesia, create more jobs, and industrialize and move up the value chain. That doing it this way, you're gonna challenge those structures of dependencies, but don't expect it that it's gonna be smooth, because the powerful of this world will fall down on you. And that's exactly what the EU has done against Indonesia. It took it to court inside the World Trade Organization, saying, how dare Indonesia do this? And I mentioned in my talk a little bit, just in passing, that we need to challenge the global architecture of trade and investment, because there are trade agreements between the EU and certain countries like Tunisia. They have the trade agreements that dictates to you what you should do and what you shouldn't be doing. And there are clauses in there, if you dare change the law, that would limit the profits of certain companies, or let's say in case of Indonesia that does not want to export the raw form but want to create more value, they would take you to international courts and they would sue you and they would pressure you because they want to maintain you in that global order. But Indonesia is not alone in this. Zambia is trying to do it. I believe DRC as well, Zimbabwe, and there is talk between the 3 Latin American countries. They are very rich in lithium, which is another mineral that is needed in the transition, to create a kind of what they call a lithium OPEC. OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Producing Countries. So they say we're going to do a kind of a lithium OPEC so we can have more leverage in the global market to dictate the prices of how we sell and how we do it. Because if you don't do that, countries like the US or the EU will do everything to get those cheap natural resources, use them to industrialize themselves and to advance technology, and they go and sell that technology to countries like Namibia or Morocco without any transfer of technology. So for me, these are ways of looking positively at the matter. There is also hope in the question of climate finance, because I talked about climate reparations and climate debt. We've seen the establishment of a fund last year, or facility called the Loss and Damage facility in the COP27. And this year, there have been more promises to fund this. So right now, there is around $400 million in that fund. To help impoverished countries or much more vulnerable countries to climate crisis, adapt, and also move towards renewable energy. But there are many questions around this loss and damage. That's why everything is contradictory. We need to keep pushing for this loss and damage facility to be legally binding, that the biggest polluters, the richest countries need to be paying, and legally binding. That's one thing. We need to pay more. $400 million is not enough. We need trillions. This is for sure. Every year, we need more and more trillions. And then, as I said, it needs to be legally binding, and it needs to be in the form of wealth transfer, not additional debts. You don't give debts to indebted and impoverished countries and countries that are not responsible for causing the climate crisis. No, it needs to be transfer of wealth. We are all in this together, but there are different levels of responsibilities. So the climate justice movement is pushing for this question of climate debt and climate finance inside the COP. And we need to keep pushing, because whole islands, whole countries would disappear. A lot of people would be displaced. So we need to take urgently actions. It's hard. It's difficult. Maybe it's not hopeful. We see the COP in the Emirates headed by an oil executive, but we have no choice. We need to keep resisting. We need to target the oil and fossil companies. And I think these are things that we need to continue. And okay, I am hopeful. I am hopeful.
Thanks for giving that empowering example, and I hope all of us listening today will take this appeal that you brought up last to our hearts. And this also flows into the next question I have for you. This would be the two last remaining questions. So what needs to happen, though, so that local communities are taken into account when such green energy projects are planned? And how can activism from the global north support their cause, but also overall a just energy transition?
I'll start with the second question, because I keep hearing it, and it's an important one. What can we do in the global north? First of all, I said this, we need to raise awareness of those injustices and those sacrifice zones. We need to say clearly, that's not the just transition that we want, and not in our names. Because we have power here in the West, we can protest, we can organize actions in countries in the global South. Sometimes it's possible, sometimes it's not. That's one thing. Second thing, most of the capital, most of the companies involved in those projects have their headquarters in the global north. We need to target them there. We need to target them in London, target them in Germany, target them in France, in the US. We need to target those companies. Like my favorite eco-Marxist is Andreas Malm, who wrote a book called How to Blow Up a Pipeline. I don't know if you are aware of it, but the gist of the argument, maybe I'm simplifying it a bit here, is that if we don't target directly, if we don't engage in direct action against the fossil fuel capital or the fossil fuel companies, if we don't stop their operations, they will never stop. And he brings many examples from the past, anti-colonial struggle, anti-apartheid, and so if we don't organize to challenge them and pressure them and make it very expensive to them to continue drilling oil and gas, it will never happen. So we need to organize, keep organizing, and don't think about these issues as individuals. We need to think about them as organized groups, join environmental organizations. But at the same time, it shouldn't be just Eurocentric activism, forgetting about what's happening in other parts of the world. What is the GIZ is doing, for example? What is your government is trying to do in certain parts of the world? We need to raise questions in terms of sovereignty of the local communities. Are they gonna benefit? Is this a project Is it a win-win situation? I'm not against, you know, Germany investing in those countries. We need to work together. But how do we do it? We need to do it in equal terms, win-win situation, benefiting the local priorities first, especially if those projects are being built there. And those countries are not really responsible for the climate crisis. So there are a lot of things that need to be done. And then it's not just the fossil fuel industry. We shouldn't be making this just about the fossil fuel industry. It's about agribusiness as well, industrial farming. We need to tackle them because, you know, industrial farming and agrobusiness are responsible for around 30% of the CO2 emissions. So it's a big industry that we need to transform to make it more sustainable. And this is linked to the questions of democratizing our economic energy systems here in Europe. They cannot be left in the hand, and food systems as well, in the hand of big corporations. So we need to, and then the finance, the banking. Who gives those subsidies? Who finances those projects? We need to do the research. Look, like in here, Barclays. I know that Barclays Bank is a big bankroller of fossil fuel industry and armament industry. It needs to be tackled. It needs to be highlighted. It needs to be shamed. They need to be shamed. So this is how I answer that question. And Freddie, I forgot the the first part of the question. What was the first part?
I think you answered it perfectly.
All right. Okay.
So it was about the local communities. I think, do you want to take a minute to answer that one as well as the last remaining question?
Yeah. So how do we make sure that the local communities are not excluded? So there are many mechanisms that are not like existing mechanisms that are not respected clearly and that are not enforced. Some of them call them informed consent or proper consultation processes. There are many that can be done properly and improved. But like I tell you, I give you an example. The Warzet solar plant that I described. So there was a consultation process. You know what they did? They went and talked to a representative of the community, three men. They took them to a 5-star hotel. They did to them a PowerPoint presentation. And they tell them, this is the project coming from the king. So you need to approve, you need to sign this document. And that's what they did. The communities did not know that this was happening. So definitely we can do better. We can do more consultation, tell people, inform them. Don't see them as stupid people or backward people or they don't understand. It is their land, it is their resources, it is their environment. We need to make them involved. We need to be patient, take the time to consult them, make them understand and tell them what are the impacts and don't lie about the impacts. We shouldn't be lying about the impacts. If there are impacts, they need to be clearly identified and mitigation processes are proposed in order to minimize the negative impacts. In terms of water, for example, that has not been thought through. What is it? Is a semi-arid region, has been suffering from drought for several years. So they didn't think about it. We need to think about this. How do we make that solar plant work for the people while minimizing the impacts? If we need more water for that solar plant, we need to find a solution. And then the other question, who's going to fund this? It shouldn't be the local population. It should be either the state if they have money. In this case, they don't. So it needs to be those climate debts, those climate reparations, or maybe taxing the corporate sector to raise the money and do certain projects that help the communities. Yeah, so I think I'll stop here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invite. I hope that was useful to you.
Thank you for joining us and thank you for your time. I think Also, the question that you brought up, or the answer that you brought out loud, this is really essential to collaborate. And I think also what I take forward personally from this lecture are these 4 questions you mentioned of political economy, to really thoroughly analyze the issues at hand. And yeah, thanks also for joining us today again, to the people viewing us on Zoom and also to the people present here in the lecture hall. And have a nice rest of your evening. I hope we will see each other next week. So bye, everyone.
Thank you.